Good afternoon. I would like to call this to order this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. We'll begin with item 1 on our agenda, prayer, and I'll ask Mr. Thompson to lead us in prayer. Please stand.
Dear God, thank you for this day as we work for the residents of the Northwest Territories. Please allow us opening ears and open hearts as we listen to the minister as he presents to us today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Please be seated. Committee, there's an agenda before you. We are on item 2, review and adoption of the agenda. Are there any comments, questions, additions, or deletions to the agenda? Hearing none, can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Mr. McNeely, all those in favor? Thank you. The agenda is adopted. Item 3, declarations of conflict of interest. Are there any conflict of interest? Hearing none, we'll move on to today's committee business, public briefing on cannabis sales and distribution with the Honourable Robert C. McLeod, Minister of Finance. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. The committee is very pleased to have this opportunity, which has been on many Northerners' minds since the cannabis legislation was passed earlier this year. Before we go to the minister's opening comments, I would also like to take this time to remind members and witnesses that our proceedings today are being recorded for rebroadcast on the Legislative Assembly's television network. Proceedings are also streaming on the Assembly's Facebook page, and we have our public affairs officer somewhere in the room right there who will be taking pictures as well. I'll ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with Mr. Nakamayak.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Herb Nakamak from the Nakput.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Shane Thompson, the Hindi.
Welcome, Corey Banthine, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Welcome, Michael Nadley, MLA for Ditchell.
Good afternoon. Danny McNeely, Satu.
Good afternoon. Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
RJ Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
And I'm Kieran Tester, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table are Committee Clerk Jennifer Franki-Smith and Committee Research Advisors April Taylor and Megan Welsh. We also are joined by the Honourable Louis Siebert, Minister of Justice, who is in attendance in the audience. I'll now, and the committee recognizes your attendance, Minister. I'll ask Minister McLeod to introduce his witnesses for the record and proceed with any opening remarks. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, committee. We are here to provide an overview of the GNWT's approach to the legislation and sale of cannabis in the NWT. With me today are Mr. David Stewart, Deputy Minister of Finance and Secretary to the Financial Management Board. Sandy Kugluktar is our Deputy Secretary to the Financial Management Board. Also in attendance are Peter Mahar, Director of the Liquor Operations, Kelly Bluck, Director of Fiscal Policy, Amy Kennedy, Manager of Policy and Communications with Shared Corporate Services in the Department of Finance, and Mr. Robert Collinson, my Ministerial Special Advisor. As members know, on October 17, 2018, the sale of cannabis will be legalized. Following passage of the Cannabis Products Act, the Department of Finance has been working to prepare for the distribution and sales on non-medical cannabis within the Northwest Territories. We have also been working with the Department of Justice on regulations associated with the Act and on an information guide related to the potential establishment of other cannabis vendors. October 17, 2018 marks the start to legalized cannabis sales in Canada, and the GNWT is ready. I don't doubt that, like any other province and territory, there will be challenges, but I believe we are well positioned to address these. With the Chair's approval, I would like to ask the Deputy Minister to take us through a brief presentation, after which I will answer any questions members may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. You may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll keep this at relatively short. Starting on slide 2, just a bit of an overview. As members are well aware, there's been ongoing preparation for legalization of cannabis on October 17th, 2018, and that work is really across a variety of sectors. Today we'll be talking mainly about the distribution and sales within the NWT. So we'll cover off the retail arrangements that we've got in place, our cannabis supply, retail pricing, online sales, the regulations and the retail framework, and then some of the communications activities. So on slide 3, on retail arrangements, on legalization date, we will have cannabis available to NWT residents through the liquor stores in Yellowknife, Hay River, Fort Smith, Fort Simpson, and Norman Wells. And there will be online sales that will be accessible through the Northwest Territories Liquor and Cannabis Commission to all residents. The liquor vendor in Inuvik has indicated that they do not wish to sell cannabis, and therefore for people in Inuvik, initially they will have cannabis through the online store on October 17th, and then we'll begin the process of identifying a retail distributor over the coming months. Similar to liquor sales, the retailers will obtain cannabis through the Liquor and Cannabis Commission, and then will be paid a retail commission on that. On slide 4, talks a little bit about the suppliers. So we expect to obtain whole flowers, oils, seeds, and pre-rolls from major cannabis producers in Canada. So we have product coming from High Park, which is a subsidiary of Tilray, a major producer in Canada. We also will get some supply from Canopy Growth, which is another large supplier, and Aurora Cannabis. We've obtained pricing for about 100 products of various blends and package sizes, and we'll have to determine as the products get sold in the NWT what consumer preference will be. We obviously won't be carrying 100 products, but we will be able to start to see over time where the preferences are. We do expect that cannabis supply will be an issue. We're hearing reports of that from across Canada. And we will be working with other suppliers. So there's about 120 across Canada, I believe, that have been licensed suppliers. So we will be working with other suppliers in addition to these 3 large companies to try to make sure that we are able to have enough supply to keep the things moving along. By all reports across working with suppliers and through other provinces and territories, this is expected to be a bit of a short-term problem of the supply that's available, but we believe we will at least be able to try to manage our way through that. Slide 5 gives you a sense of the sample retail pricing, and this is really, as I say, there's a lot of products that we will be able to bring in. But this gives you a sense of the range. So at the lower end, we believe that cannabis will retail for about $8.21 per gram, and that's GST included. And that will then range all the way up to about $14.55 for the premium products. And we have products across the entire range of that price range. Packaging usually was available or is available in a 1 gram package, a 3.5 gram package, and 7 grams. These prices are all per gram. The expectation, although like most of the things with the cannabis file, we won't really know until we start to sell it, but we expect that the 3.5 gram package is probably going to be the most popular. In terms of THC levels, they vary by product that we order from, but by a general rule of thumb, for the regular blends, the THC levels range from about 14 to 20%. And some of those more premium blends that are in the higher price range, the THC level tends to be between 20 and 25%. For the online sales, the Canada Post shipping rates will apply as well to the online purchases that we will be doing. On slide 6, just gives you a screenshot. We will be ready to go on October 17th with our online sales. We will only be carrying High Park or Tilray products online. It works, it will work very similar to any other online sort of e-commerce where there'll be product information and a variety of details, including THC levels and those sorts of things about it. There'll be age verification required on pickup. There will not be there'll be about 8 to 10 products we think are initially available in the online sales environment. And then age verification, as I say, Canada Post will ship to the communities throughout the NWT, and people will have to verify their age at that point and have ID to be able to pick up the product. On slide 7 is just a little bit about the regulations and retail framework. So as members are well aware, there was a commitment to produce regulations for the Cannabis Products Act, and they've been completed. But a key element of that process or of that document is the process related to entities that want to become cannabis vendors. So we have produced an information guide that will be up on the website, or is up on the website now, I suspect. I think there's copies of it here as well. And that guide really is a plain language guide for potential parties that might be interested in becoming a vendor, that describes the application process, gives information to help applicants make some business decisions, and provides information on how the retail vendors will be able to buy and sell the product if they do become a vendor in the NWT. Slide 8 gives you an overview of the vendor application process. So just walking through that briefly, and this is all laid out in that information guide. So this will start with an expression of interest. So the way that this will take place is that if you're in a community, or if you're an individual that wants to become a vendor, they will provide an expression of interest to the Director of Liquor Operations at the Commission. We will take that and then do some community engagement to see if there's support for a cannabis store there, whether it's an additional cannabis store or whether it's a community that doesn't currently have one. We'll also look at the demand that's out there and see whether it's reasonable to establish a store in that location. And following that, there'll be a public request for proposal process. So while an individual may come in and say they'd like to open a cannabis store, if we go ahead and start a process, it'll be through a public RFP. The next step in the process is that anybody that is interested in becoming a vendor would go through the pre-application security screening, and there's a whole variety of information we'll ask about the vendor, as well as any partners and businesses that may be participating in setting up that potential cannabis store. Screening on that basis. For those that check through the security process, then they'll submit a full application package. And that process is again laid out in the guide, but it really is a full detailed business plan of what they're proposing. It will lay out, or they will tell us what kind of other products they're proposing to include in the store, as well as some description of the site and the store location that they are wanting to have. We will then do a review of that application, and in the guide it lays out the criteria that we will use. And it is things like meeting the regulatory and legislative requirements, that there's no issues around public health or safety and security, that they understand the startup costs and they have a clear idea of where they'll get their funding, that sort of stuff, and that the endeavor is economically viable to do that. Once we get through that process, there'll be tentative approval for designating somebody as a vendor, and then they will go ahead and enter into, start setting up their store, and following that process, there'll be a pre-sale store inspection and a final process, and that includes making sure that they have a retail agreement with the Liquor and Cannabis Commission, that they have their leases in place, that they have whatever development permits or business licenses that they may need from the community, and that they've got things like fire approvals and those sorts of things in place. Once that's all in place, then the minister will be in a position to make a final designation as a cannabis vendor, and they'll be able to start the process. On slide 9, you've probably noted that we've started some communication activities, as well as other departments are doing some work in this area as well, around communications around cannabis generally, and particularly around some of the specific elements. The screenshots that is there is the new website that describes or provides information for residents around cannabis, including things like possession limits and growing and buying cannabis, as well as some of the health effects and the impact on driving and those sorts of things. There was a household mailer that's being shipped to all households in the NWT and went out about a week ago, so everybody should be getting that if they haven't got it yet. We will have point-of-sale material available through the liquor stores as well as through the website to make sure that people have good access to information. There are plans for, and in full development now and should be ready to go here in the next week or so, a video that will be shown through things like, obviously be available through the website, but also through things like the movie theaters and those sorts of things to provide additional information. And then, as I mentioned, there's ads on both the print efforts as well as the radios. There are other departments that are involved in this that have their own part of this, including MACA, who are doing some engagement with community governments that I think there's been some reporting on, as well as Health and Social Services is also working with communities to hold meetings and better explain the impacts of cannabis and make sure that information is out there. Finally, as the minister noted, we believe we're ready for cannabis legalization on October 17th. We really do believe it's not a singular event, but rather it's part of that process of legalization that has taken place over a relatively short period of time. I think we all know there's uncertainty in terms of the market size and what the product preferences will be. We obviously have some questions around supply. And then there's various other implications associated with legalization that we will need to be able to respond to. This isn't the end of the process. The federal government has indicated there'll be consideration of edibles probably within a year or so, and undoubtedly that will also require future adjustments. But with that, Mr. Chair, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Committee, there are three documents, or two documents in addition to the presentation. One is the NWT Retail Cannabis Framework Information Guide. The other are the Cannabis Act regulations. You may ask questions about the presentation or these documents, and you'll be allowed 5 minutes of time to do so. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the first question we need to know, and I think the general public needs to know, because we're only looking at 8 to 10 products for online right now. How is the government going to regulate from southern companies, actually, people accessing the southern companies to provide this product, not just the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson, Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It actually would be illegal for other companies to ship into the NWT. They're not supposed to be shipping products across borders. So the only way that you can get it online is through our site, is the only legal way for residents to obtain it.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Stewart for that answer. So do we have a system in place, though, that, somebody sends an envelope, because people are going to be creative to get the product out there? Because, right now, we're only looking at 100. There's 3,000 products or types of this product. So as I learned on our tour, is it, I thought, 50, 60. Now we're only doing 100. So what does the government done? Is it working with the federal government to stop making sure this doesn't happen? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So my understanding is that the legislation to legalize it would require anybody that is a supplier, including the online ones, to not ship across borders of provinces and territories. So they would be breaking the law in that case. So we certainly are working with other provinces and the federal government. There's pretty constant communications to try to ensure those sorts of things don't happen. But that's really the process is through that process of them being licensed and the federal government, I think, has done a pretty good job of controlling the supply and knowing where it is, and should be able to catch any instance like that should somebody want to take that risk, which I would think would be quite a risk for a supplier. So.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. So when we talk about the security screen in that, I know with the federal government, it's really in depth. Should you want to grow it, if you have a criminal record with drugs, you can't deal with that. Is this similar to our screening process for when dealing with this product? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the guide describes this a little bit, but yes, we will be looking for anybody that's a partner in an organization that wants to become a vendor, family members, those sorts of things, and we will be doing criminal background checks and asking for some financial disclosures and those sorts of information to ensure that we're not allowing that as a process for what would be the illegal activity right now to work its way in. So yes, we'll be doing fairly extensive security checks before it gets to the phase of actually recommending somebody as a vendor.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. And my final question is, I know with cannabis, and we're trying to curb, the illegal sale of this product and that. So how are we going to be able to gauge that it's working? Because I'm hearing rumors right now, they're going to see a sell price and dealers are going to go underneath that. And there's other people that use the product right now and they don't want to be known. They don't want to be seen going to the liquor store. They don't want to see getting a package from the government. So how are we going to be able to track this, curb this illegal activity? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's a good question in terms of how do you actually measure that illegal activity outside of things like police reported crimes and those sorts of things, and I think we'll have to keep an eye on that. I think we'll also have, because of the point of sale system that we use, we'll have a really good sense of both on the online side and on the liquor store side the kinds of volumes that we're seeing. And if we get a good, I think we'll be watching that to see are there really significant variations that would suggest that maybe there's other supply going into an area. If, for example, I'll pick on Norman Wells, is showing really low relative sales to anywhere else, it at least would be a question then what's going on there in terms of that. And I think, generally I think there's an awareness out there that we will be able to get some sort of unofficial monitoring of that kind of thing as well. This will be a transition though. I think everybody recognizes that not everybody is going to want to go into the liquor store. The online, we're estimating that it could be between 30 and 50% of the sales will be online. We don't know for sure, obviously, we'll have to see, but part of the reason for that is that stigma. Over time, that will change as it becomes a more typical process to purchase cannabis, but it is something we're going to have to try to monitor as best we can in terms of knowing that we have taken that bite out of the illegal market. That is the expectation across Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I noticed the price points are about $8.21 to about 14 something, and it will be sold in 1, 3.5, and 7 gram packages typically. How does this compare to, I guess, the street price of cannabis right now? Because there's a volume discount. If you go and you buy a gram, it's a lot more expensive than if you buy per gram than if you buy an ounce. Is that going to apply to the sale through the retail outlets? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, if you look at the per gram cost, the per gram cost of the same product for a 7 gram package is less than for a 1 gram package. So you do see that kind of volume changes. These are all per gram prices, but I think when people will see the full range of products, they'll be able to see that fairly quickly. The reports, and again, it's hard to know where everybody's price is in terms of the illegal market, but the reports seem to suggest, and the planning was that if we are in that $8 to $10 range, certainly anything under $10, we would be that would be quite competitive with the illegal market. Whether that still then there's an adjustment in that market to try to undercut it, that's certainly a possibility, but that's all part of this process, I think. I think the other side of that, which is just a reality, is the safety and the inspection and the licensed growers, and that over time I think will force out that illegal market. But that's something that's obviously the policy goal of going with legalization. So we'll see if that works out that way.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So just to be clear, there will be essentially a volume discount on cannabis sold through the GNWT retailers. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The per gram cost on a larger package will be less than the per gram cost if you only ordered 1 gram, so yes.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that was a concern of some of the members and members of the general public as well, that it's still, if you're only selling by the gram at a fixed cost, it would be cheaper to go to a drug dealer. And this is part of the reason for this legislation is to remove the criminal element and the black market. That was a concern. I noticed that, and actually, would we be able to get those costs? Is that something that GNWT has, the price of the volume discount, the price of, say, a 7 gram package? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think, we can provide the whole 100 products or so that we've got with the detail of the pricing and that. Again, we'll start with a smaller number, and consumer preference undoubtedly will drop some of those off, but certainly from the 3 main suppliers, we've got price lists that we can provide to committee. So.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. And on a different topic, there was discussion of the special occasion permits, which are allowed in the Act, and that could be for, the same way right now you can get occasion permits for selling alcohol. I don't see anything in here about those being readily available, and in fact, it looks like one of the documents says that there will be no applications accepted for special occasion permits. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kilgoodker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, the member is right that the Act does provide for allowing special occasion permits, but we just haven't developed the regs around those yet, and that's more of a long-term plan, but this weren't anticipated in the early days, but it is something that is on our radar. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we had a lot of discussions in this room about those permits. So when can we expect those regulations to be developed? Thank you.
Mr. Kilgoodker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think as the rules around edible products become more clear, I think we'll start thinking of developing regulations for special occasion permits at the same time. It's just our focus currently has been on getting the regs around the retail stores finalized, and we'll start turning our attention to the special occasion permits. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to let the minister know I'd like to see those regulations developed sooner than later. Nothing further. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister, would you like to respond? No? All right. We'll move on to the next person in the queue, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I've had a chance to look at the material that's been released, I guess, today. It is a fairly onerous process that a potential vendor would have to go through. They have to provide financial information, history, criminal record checks, information about family members as well. What sort of measures are we going to put in place to protect that information from being shared all over the place? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think it would be similar to the processes we use now when people apply, so I think maybe, I don't know that we'll do any special provisions around the confidentiality, but it will be a fairly small circle that would be involved in any sort of assessment of that kind of information that we get from people. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, if we haven't worked that out now, I would strongly advise that you put in place some measures to protect people's personal information. The regulations and the background information guide seem to allow a lot of discretion on the part of the minister to decide at the end of the day who's going to be permitted to become a vendor or not. I don't see any timelines in either the guide or the regulations. And I understood the regulations were supposed to set out the public interest guidelines or criteria. I can't find them in the regulations. So what happened to the regulations, and why don't they really reflect that public interest slant that was put on it originally, and why is there no timelines? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. First, in terms of the timelines, I mean, this is a new process. Obviously, there'll be a great deal of interest for any potential vendor to have us move this along, and it certainly would be our intention to move it along as quickly as we can. Not knowing yet what the level of detail we will get from potential vendors or how many potential vendors might apply for a distribution in a particular community, it's difficult to put those kind of timelines, but I think that's something that certainly there'll be a fair amount of attention on, so we'll want to make sure that we're watching that. In terms of the public interest, I think the section under the review of the application and some of the elements that will go into the decision making, I think that's laid out there. That may not be
the view of what maybe was originally intended on that, but I think it does speak to that the reviewing of the applications will be around some of those issues that the member had identified. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I didn't really get a lot of reassurance. The information guide says, and I respect what the Deputy Minister said, that you don't know how many applications there are going to be, or expressions of interest and applications to ultimately become a vendor and so on. But there's no assurance that there's actually going to be a decision made, and no timelines for that. So no requirement, in fact, for the Minister to actually make a decision. The Minister could just decide, oh, we're not going to allow any private entrepreneurs to become vendors. I'd expected to see something a little bit like, if you've met these criteria, it's an automatic approval. But that's not what the regulations or the information guide seem to say. So can you confirm that there is, in fact, no timelines, no requirement for the Minister to actually make a decision on a vendor application? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So you're correct, there are no timelines. There certainly is, the process lays out leading to a recommendation and a decision by the Minister. So I think there will be a decision one way or the other. In terms of just anybody that meets the criteria could get be allowed to be a vendor. I think that certainly wasn't the intention of what we were looking at. We certainly didn't envision a scenario where there would be 15 new stores in a community, for example. Part of it was to assess the market and assess the economic viability of the venture, because nobody wants to set people up for failure. So I think all of those factors will go into it. So there will be, as that public process unfolds, there will have to be some sort of an assessment and advice that's provided to the Minister as to both the number as well as the recommendation around approving people to be designated as a vendor. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Green, you have the floor.
Thank you. I heard Mr. Stewart say that the actions they were taking in pricing allowed him to hope they would force out the illegal market. I'd like some detail about how the government is in fact going to deal with the illegal market. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the work we did with the federal government, there was a strong sense that, and this was right from the finance side as well as some of the other departments that were involved, was that if the retail pricing was in the range of averaging under $10 a gram, they felt that was the price point in which they would get this success in terms of moving out the illegal market. I think any government, whether it's the federal or provincial government or any one of the territorial governments, can't know for certain if that's going to take place. There certainly was some information gathered from the Canadian public on what they were paying for illegal cannabis, but that frankly was a volunteer type basis, so it's hard to know exactly how the veracity around some of that information. But the policy approach all the way along was, if we can keep the price under $10, that the feeling was that would eventually move, because of the quality issue and because of the potential safety issues around the illegal market, as well as being competitive on price, that we would in fact be able to see the reduction in the illegal market. That was the intent of the whole exercise. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Green.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. How will the department know if the price point is in fact curbing the illegal market? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned before, there's no perfect method on that. I think what we will be able to look at is some of the volume information as the market starts to. I think we'll be able to compare ourselves quite well because of the tracking that's being done in the rest of Canada. So I think we'll be able to have a fairly strong sense, as well as the police-related activities for drug-related offenses and those sorts of things. I think that's is probably the types of indicators that we are going to be able to get. Being the north, I also think we'll have pretty good intel from our residents as to what's going on out there. But there isn't going to be a single sort of eureka indicator that we'll be able to say, there, we know we've taken care of the entire illegal market. I don't think that's going to be possible. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Green.
Thank you. Considering that removing the illegal market is the purpose of this, the oversight of the illegal market seems to be very fluid, to put it politely. There's a sense that'll be used, some police activity, but exactly how is the department going to monitor that illegal activity? I mean, it exists now. Are there any metrics now? Is there anything you can compare it to? I don't understand how the illegal market will be displaced, especially in communities that don't have vendors. What is the impetus for people to stop using their local drug dealer and wait for Canada Post to deliver the product instead? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I really think that the best indicator for us will be the information that we get on our own sales, and then comparing that with some of the past information that was out there around consumption levels and those sorts of things, and volumes. So the idea behind the system that both the federal government has done in its licensing of producers right through to what we will be doing with our retailers is it's really intended to be a seed to sale type of a tracking system. So we should know at a community level, for example, for the online system of how much is being shipped in. We also have an NWT stamp on our product, similar to the tobacco stamp, so we will know if people are bringing in product from anywhere, any other jurisdiction, so that will help as well. So I think, as I said before, that we should be able to track, we should be able to know based on past population type surveys of the rough kind of volumes that you would expect to see. And then I think some of that police-related data will help with us as well. But I think that's how we will track and know whether our retail sales are actually putting a dent in that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Yeah, thank you for that response. So what kind of information do you have on consumption levels historically? Where did it come from and how much confidence do you have in it? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So through both Statistics Canada and the NWT Bureau of Stats, they've done a variety of alcohol and drug surveys over the years that provide us with a little bit of a glimpse in terms of the percentage of the population 15 and over that would have consumed cannabis in the last 12 months. What I've seen of that data, it's less detailed in terms of the amount, but it does give us a sense of the population type usage. And I think there's a recent survey that is in the final stages now that'll give us sort of more current information on that type of thing. I believe the Canadian Community Health Survey also contains information on cannabis consumption at a territorial level. So these are broad indicators that will help us with sort of a sense of where things have been. And then through our own sales tracking, we should be able to have a better sense of how much of that we seem to be capturing. So. And I think that's the situation for every jurisdiction, frankly. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart? Mr. McNeely, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got two questions here at this point in time here. On the issue of overconsumption, what readiness measures or consultation is the department taken with the health centers? Thank you.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I wouldn't want to speak for the Department of Health, but I do know that they have been engaged already and have future plans to go out and send teams to every community to help with that matter. I know they have distributed some material on that, and even through the GNWT level of some of the health effects and getting information out on that. Certainly some of the materials that we're making available both online and at point of sale, I suspect will also go. I know there's been some pamphlets and information products that are going out to health centers as well. So I think some of that work is being undertaken. I don't know the details of when it's been sent out and what's exactly out there right now. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'll give you an example. If there's a solution kit here for overconsumption of THC levels exceeding what could cause some problems, whether it's physical or mental. Those kits, I would imagine, should be sent out in preparation for worst-case scenarios. So I just mentioned that. My next question is on the non-consultation communities that the committee and the minister didn't engage with. What measures are being taken or arrangements for those non-consultation communities? I'll give you an example. 4 of the 5 Sahtu communities were not engaged in our committee trips. So is there consultation preparation sessions going to happen with the Sahtu Secretariat, for example? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's been a lot of work in this area as well. I know, for example, Municipal and Community Affairs has had a meeting through Elgant in terms of some of the issues around cannabis. There is a plan for another conference, I think, here before the end of the calendar year to engage with community governments to better understand the kinds of impacts that they have concerns about and how we help manage that. I know the Department of Health is going out, as I mentioned, they have teams going out to every community to engage both with the public sessions as well as with leadership, et cetera, around some of the health-related issues. So those are all taking place, and certainly I know in talking with the Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs, there's ongoing conversations that are taking place at the administrative level with community governments on some of the things that, the concerns they have, as well as some of the things that are expected, and a dialogue going on those sorts of areas. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that reply. My last question is, I see on the one slide, I forget which number it is here, there's product labels. Is that in reference to the product itself or the hazardous side of the product? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We could get that sort of detail. I know in what I've seen of the website, it does very much, there's clearly labels the THC levels as well as the CBD. Not an expert in those areas, but that sort of thing is labeled fairly clearly on all the products, as well as on the website on the descriptor. It includes those sorts of things so that the consumer is pretty clear on what they're getting when they order the various products. So I think they're all labeled, and I think the federal government has some rules around the level of labeling that's required on these products. So, thank you.
Mr. McNeely?
Further, I'll have some later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Mr. Stewart, the suppliers are going to have to conform to the packaging requirements established by the federal government, which committee reviewed some of those at the time of our review, and they did include THC and medical information. Is that your understanding that those requirements will still be required, Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That is my understanding. I know there's been more recent discussions about standard approaches to the labeling as well, like there is with food products, and I think that's part of that evolution that we'll see as this product evolves over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Nakamayak, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. One of the worries I have is, there's going to be a serious problem with maintaining local public safety, whether in public areas or on the roads. I'm just wondering what and for bigger centers like Yellowknife, all the major the regional centers in the territory, I'm wondering what they're doing for, as far as bylaws, as far as local enforcement. And also, this will leave out the community people with of the smaller communities who will have no support, left to individuals with major stress on leaders and local organizations, which in some cases there's only 2 or 3. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. And I'll allow this line of questioning. I just want to remind members that today's briefing is on cannabis sales and distribution, and the minister and his officials might not have all the detail of the other aspects of cannabis legalization, but I will allow this line of questioning, Mr. Nakamayak. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Nakamayak.
Yeah, thank you. All this is kind of leading up to that. So whether it's on this or that, I think it would be good for people to hear today, since this is a public briefing and not just on one aspect, but the whole let's not be one-dimensional. Let's look at the whole aspect of it and answer what we can from there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Neckamayak. Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and appreciate your comment. I'll try to answer the best I can. I know that there is funding that's flowing from the federal government to help with the training of RCMP enforcement capacity and as well as the various training of existing officers and those sorts of things. Our Department of Infrastructure is looking at changes that will help with things like getting data on baseline surveys and those sorts of things on impaired driving. With roadside surveys, and in terms of the community governments, as I mentioned, I know MACA is doing the initial planning related to, they're in contact with all the community governments, but also to understand, to have a conference with all of them in one place to understand better the issues and learn from each other around things like if there are bylaws that communities are contemplating and those sorts of things. And I know the expectation is that that'll happen before the end of the calendar year. Giving conference space and things like that, but I don't know for sure that they'll be able to pull that off, but I know that's what the planning is to have that sooner as opposed to later, so that communities can learn from each other around things like the bylaws that might be associated with this.
Thanks, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Neckamayak?
Mr. Chair. Leading up to that, leading to bylaws in the communities, I was just talking with my colleague earlier, and I'm sure in a lot of the communities in the territory, in a lot of the very smaller communities, there's no post office, there's no access to Canada Post. And we were having this conversation of not having that accessibility for northern residents. This might be an argument to help the communities have such a service. And fears that the black or the illegal sale will continue and leaving the community dynamics the way they are without building any types of bylaws or anything like that. I'm just wondering what the department is doing about that moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Certainly that's something we would want to be looking into is that is an issue with how many communities have difficulty with mail access and those sorts of things. I don't think it's a very large number, but it is certainly something that we should probably follow up on just to make sure that if the objective, as it's been stated, is to reduce the black market, then leaving communities without any access is not necessarily a good thing. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Neckamayak?
Yeah. No, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have right now. Those were kind of the issues that I have, but I'll save it for later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, in the information guide, it looks like the proposed vendor for, or somebody who wants to get approved as a vendor would have to carry out some consultation with communities. Can you just tell me what that consultation is about and how that differs from the consultation that our government may have to carry out with regard to communities?
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's really two pieces to that consultation that could take place. Is first off, if somebody comes forward with an expression of interest, we will consult with the community government to make sure that they're comfortable with. If it's a community that doesn't have a cannabis store, I suspect that consultation will be greater. If it's a community with one already, it may be a question of what's the market like, what's it going to do, business that may be selling it, those sorts of questions. The applicant themselves, as they go through the process, they will need to get the business licenses and any development permits and those sorts of things. There is detail in the framework around the physical location, but I know community governments will also be very interested in that in terms of the what's being proposed. So I think anybody that was considering becoming a cannabis vendor, it would be wise counsel to engage with the community governments as early as possible to have them as part of that process. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, again, from the information guide, it looks like the Northwest Territories Liquor Commission would have online sales, but the private vendors, if they're approved, could do mail orders, but they're not allowed to have websites, it looks like, or have online ordering capability. So how are people supposed to know where and how they're going to be able to mail order stuff. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I don't know, may need to get some further detail from somebody else, but I think in general, the online approach will be done through the government and through the Liquor Commission. There was a lot of discussion around the possibility that has to be balanced off against the seed to sale type of a tracking approach, so that we didn't include the possibility of a vendor going with online sales now and shipping into other communities and those sorts of things. We have allowed for the possibility of a mail order type approach that's used currently with liquor, particularly in a place like the Sawtooth. But I think that's one of those areas that we'll just have to see how that develops and see whether the availability of that kind of tracking that would be required to make sure that we're well aware of whatever sales are taking place. But right now, we're not contemplating that a vendor would do online sales outside of the community in which they're being authorized to be a vendor in.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks. Well, the guide does talk about the stores being able to do mail orders, so they're not allowed to have a website. They could do mail orders, so people are going to look at the Liquor Commission website and know that they could order that product from a retailer by mail. Like if somebody, somebody in Sax Harbor wants to buy, they could put phone a retailer in Inuvik rather than going through the Liquor Commission. Is that how this is going to work? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
So thanks, Mr. Chair. So one of the issues with the mail order side that we'll have to be really careful with the existing stores and anybody that wanted to get into this is around the issue of access by minors. And we have an age verification process worked out for our online sales, but they'll need to be able to do that as well. So I think this is something we're going to have to continue to look at in terms of the approach. And to see, but I think, this has to be viewed through the lens of being very careful that we are not finding ways for people that shouldn't be having it, i.e. minors, to gain access through that. The mail order that is being proposed is similar to what's currently offered through the liquor stores, and the process will be the same in terms of the orders must be in writing, they have to provide a method for payment, and they must be signed off. And payment is actually made before the shipment is done. So I think we're trying to be fairly controlled in terms of the mail order process, but I do think this is an area that, technology being what it is, that we'll have to continue to visit as we go forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I still find that kind of confusing, and I'm sure the public will, but the 17% commission rate that's mentioned in the information guide, is that the same kind of commission is that the same commission for liquor? Thanks, Mr. Chair. Or how was it arrived at? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the retail commission, it's a little higher than liquor, but the volumes will be certainly lower as well. But it's relatively consistent. I believe the liquor average is 12%. 12% is the average commission on liquor. The way it was arrived at was really looking at our supply and what we were able to get from a producer price type of a perspective, looking at the taxes and markups that are part of the price and making sure that we were able to pay a competitive commission that made sure that the vendors would be able to be economically viable, but still keeping that price point under that $10 average for the various products, recognizing that there's a range of products that are out there. But that's the process we went through, and to try to determine a retail commission rate and to make sure that everybody was satisfied with the same commission rate. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. O'Reilly, your time's expired. You can go back on the list if you'd like. Just further to Mr. O'Reilly's questioning, on page 2 of the regulations, section 4.1, it says no common carrier shall transport cannabis for delivery from a cannabis store to a person at an address located within the community in which the cannabis store is situated. Can you provide a definition of common carrier, Mr. Stewart?
I can't. You know the definition of common carrier? ask, Mr. Chair, with your approval, Peter Mahar is the Director of Liquor Operations and deals with the term common carrier on liquor side, so maybe he would have a definition for us on that, Peter.
Mr. Mahar, please approach the witness table. Introduce yourself for the record and then proceed.
Peter Mahar, I'm the Director of Liquor Operations. So under the Act, a common carrier would be a taxi or a delivery service, trucking company, anybody of that nature.
Thank you, Mr. Mahar. That concludes my question to that point. Mr. Van Fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate my previous, or my colleague's previous line of questioning. I kind of want to go down that avenue as well, because you may recall one of the concerns that I shared in the days that we were reviewing the legislation was that I was concerned that, originally that the government of the Northwest Territories was going to be the sole provider, and that retail was going to be pushed down the road to the tune of a year or two down the road, and by then we would have lost the opportunity. But I'm happy to see the retail framework being put in place. But just a little bit around pricing and taxation. Let's use, say, the $8 a gram. Can you give us a little bit better idea on, of that, if that's what a person's going to buy it for, how much of that is your actual purchase price from the supplier? How much of that will the vendor, the GNWT vendor, the liquor store, be able to carve off as a brokerage fee or retail fee? And then how much is the taxation portion of that? Can we get some description on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr.
Sorry, Mr. Stewart, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So what we'll do is I'll give you a detailed calculation. So this will be general information that I'll provide now. But so all of the various product lines obviously have different producer price associated with it. So for the $8 one, that may be in the range of, let's say, $4 a gram. On top of that, they charge the dollar excise tax, that the federal excise tax that they'll be sharing with the provincial and territorial governments. There is then a markup rate that the Liquor and Cannabis Commission that will apply, and that goes into the wholesale price then. And then the 17% that we are paying for retail commission is on top of that. There is 17% of that wholesale price. But we'll break down all those individual components for you and provide comparable numbers on the liquor side, for example, so you'll be able to see what the Liquor Commission markups are for cannabis versus the liquor side. But again, it was really starting from that point of what is where we want to end up in terms of the final price and what are the terms and conditions related to the taxation agreement that we signed to get the share of the excise tax that the federal government offered, and to do that in a way that's consistent with what other provinces and territories are doing. But I will get you the detailed calculation of a few examples that you'll be able to see then exactly how that all goes together. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Thine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the explanation. I'm trying to wonder now a little bit about those who would be setting up a retail shop. In your description just now, when you got to what you described as the wholesale, there's, you have a few variables and then you get the wholesale. Then there's like a 17% portion that's kind of added on that as the, call it the profit or what have you. Your wholesale portion included the GNWT's kind of liquor store brokerage fee, is that correct? Yes, okay. So does a retail operator end up buying from the GNWT as the wholesaler, or are they able to go to the same list of approved suppliers that the government goes to? Can we get clarification on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the model we've set up is that any retailer or vendor, whether it's a liquor store or another vendor that comes along, will buy it from the NWT Liquor and Cannabis Commission. So they will get their supply from us. And that's part of that tracking. That's an important part of this system, is to be able to track right through. But the system that we've described in the framework is that all vendors will order their products. That also allows us to have everybody use our point of sale system so that we are able to track consumption and sales through that way, as well as the product preferences and those sorts of things. As the market matures, I mean, we'll always be needing to look at this. I mean, I think there's an expectation that producer price may go down. Some of the consumer preference will become more obvious. I think there is probably a likelihood that there might be smaller growers that get created, that there may be an interest in that. So I think all of that will be part of that ongoing dynamic on the pricing. But the way that the framework is laid out is that everybody will buy through the Liquor and Cannabis Commission.
Mr. Bethine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'm trying to do is make sure that the retail opportunities can compete, because they're going to essentially be competing with the government as it relates to price points at the end of the day. And do we feel that after the wholesale prices has been decided and that they've met the ability to buy that retail are then they're free to set their own market price thereafter, or is there a pricing structure that they would follow? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We will be providing retail pricing to them, but I would also recall that one of the things we're doing is allowing for other products, and I think that'll be part of that business plan that people will lay out in terms of where do they think their sales will be. Certainly when we set the commission rates, we were well aware of and thinking through what an establishment might look like that's separate. One of the things that we were quite insistent on is that the commission should be the same, whether it's another vendor that comes along or through the liquor vendors that are in place now. So everybody will be treated consistently, and then they'll be able to add whatever other products that were within the guidelines for, whether that be some of the associated products with that, or things like we've talked about, you know, T-shirts and all those kinds of things that somebody might want to have in their facility. So all of that will be part of it, but in terms of the retail price, that will come from us.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Van Thang, your time's expired. We'll now move on to Mr. Natalie. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, wanted to say thank you for providing that overview in terms of the status of the march towards the legalization of cannabis. It's only next week. The minister noted that of course, there's challenges on any new initiatives, and I just wanted to understand during this period of implementation, legalization, and transition, whether the government will be taking on a level of monitoring, and if there's any specific areas of interest that you might be closely monitoring.
Mr. Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think probably our main tool for monitoring, and we've absolutely built it into our online system, is to be able to track sales almost on a real-time kind of basis. So we'll be able to see exactly what's going on in both the in-person type vendors that through the liquor stores, as well as any of the online sales, and be able to monitor that way. And I think, you know, if there are issues that creep up, we'll know it pretty quickly. And I think, you know, certainly, we don't spend a lot of time bugging Peter or Mr. Mahar about liquor sales on a daily basis, but I can see wanting, and I'm sure members would be interested in getting fairly frequent updates on how things are going in the initial stages, so that we can make sure that it's working the way that we expect it to. But it'll really be through those point-of-sale system that we'll be able to tell exactly what's going on out there. So, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Natalie.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's expected that tracking of sales will be one aspect of the monitoring. I was kind of curious in terms of what might eventually become at least a period of adjustment, that the government might have a particular focus on an area. I know there's been interest in terms of ensuring that business people that had an interest in terms of legitimate business people that wanted to have an interest in terms of getting into the sales could be allowed at some point. And I think within the period of consultation, we've heard from people that the level of expectation of maybe a 6-month time frame of perhaps reassessment and maybe adjusting the sales of how the implementation would be happening. Is there still those thoughts in terms of the government undertaking this major initiative, and what are the anticipated areas of interest that governments might be focusing on. I know, the next stage is edibles, what if we come across this dilemma of that supplies are very thin? Like, what kind of adjustments will this government be making?
Mr. Stewart? Oh, sorry, Minister. Mr. Minister, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, member made a good point that there will be a period of adjustment, and I think that's what we're trying to demonstrate here is there's going to be some adjustment, and changes may need to be made. Member's question about the legitimate business potentially getting into the sale of legalized cannabis, there'll be an opportunity for that. If they meet the criteria as laid out in the regulations, then there could be some opportunity there for them. After 6 months, we'll have a fairly good indication of how this is going down. We'll have a fairly good indication of the sales and the demand on this and the effect it might be having on the illegal market. So I think 6 months is a good time frame to see where we're at with this. But member is absolutely correct. I mean, there is going to be a period of adjustment. This is brand new to all of us in this room, and so I think the department have demonstrated that they've done a lot of work coming up with our challenge of dealing with the issues, and they did it within the 6 month that was asked about back in the May-June session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Nadley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At what point would we expect perhaps a status report from the government? 6 months is more likely March, perhaps around that time. Should we expect a report?
Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you. I can make a commitment here that, this all goes legal on October the 17th, so I can make a commitment here for the first part of it. We'll give committee quick updates on how things are going and any adjustments that need to be made. And then after 6 months again, we can have a sit down and have a more thorough presentation. But I will make the commitment that we'll keep committee updated as we move along into the legalization of cannabis.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Your time's expired, Mr. Nadley. Next on my list is Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess just to follow up with this 100 products out there, is each liquor store going to have these 100 products, or is it going to be a variety? I guess the distribution center will have the 100. Thank you,
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding is not all the liquor store won't carry all 100 products, and I think as the deputy indicated earlier, as the consumer demands are going to dictate what the more relevant products are that you would carry in the liquor store. So the assumption is that the liquor store won't carry all 100 products. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for that answer. So will the liquor stores be able to, look at the 100 products there and work with the liquor or cannabis commission to get the products that they feel that's needed in the community? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Market demand is going to dictate what type of products that are carried in the liquor store. I mean, if the liquor store has 100 products that they could potentially carry, there may be a demand for more or a desire for different type of products. So again, it's a new system, and we'll just have to see what the market dictates as we move forward with this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, and I appreciate the Minister's answer, and I understand, market demands, but I mean, I'm looking at if it's a community and heaven forbid they know what the products are, and that's what's selling in the community. Are they able to, if we have that product, are we able to get that to the, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if there's a demand for more of a particular type of product, then the liquor stores, much like with the alcohol, they would be able to carry that particular product. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, and I thank the minister for that. I appreciate the work you guys are doing in that area. The one other question I do have is about these small communities. I have 4 small communities that do not have Canada Post. They get it shipped to a charter company that brings it in. And so how are we working with them with those online sales? How is that going to be done? Because when they say Jean Marie, they don't have a post office there. They ship it, if it goes to the post office in Fort Simpson, and they ship it in, put it in the plane, or K&K, the local contractor, and ship it that way. So how are we addressing this concern? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As the deputy indicated earlier, there are some communities without Canada Post. I wasn't really aware of that many that don't have Canada Post. So, again, it's something that we'll have to work with any potential partners to see how we can address this so that the community gets the product. So we'll continue to work with the different folks as airline companies or Canada Post, or again, it's all brand new, Mr. Thompson, and we're going to see. We'll make some adjustments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson, anything further?
Yes. I thank the minister for this. I greatly appreciate it, and like you said, it's new, and we're trying to make it work as best as we can. I mean, it wasn't something that we wanted to do. This is something the federal government wanted to do, and I think people need to recognize this. This is not something that the government of Northwest Territories, we're just responding to the federal government as we move forward. So we need to, again, implement our process, because if we don't, the federal government's going to. So my last question is, just in regards to this presentation, this information that you've given to us, can I share this information? Can I get it out publicly to, my constituents in the communities, so that they're aware of this information? So again, it's about the education process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the member's correct. This was a federal legislation, federal law, and we had to do some adjustments, and we had to try and work what was best for the Northwest Territories. So I think we've demonstrated the ability to do that. And again, it's an ongoing process. We'll see how it plays out in a few months after legalization. As far as the information goes, the member is free to share that information with his constituents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And for the members' information, we are broadcasting this meeting live. All the materials are public, and they've been posted on our website, I believe. So also for interested members of the public, that information should be live on our website now if you want to look over the documents the committee has before it. Before going to our next person on the list, I'll just remind members we have to conclude by 1:30, and I'll go through some questions of my own. So the first question I had is around the regulation on designating a vendor, and this was in the presentation as well. It says the operation of a cannabis store by the person would be economically viable. So the minister has to determine that. I guess I have a concern when the market isn't dictating the viability of a store. It's the minister's judgment. So can you give us some criteria on how the minister is going to determine the economic viability of a store before it has a chance to compete in a marketplace environment? Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's not like the minister has the authority to just designate who's going to be a vendor out of the blue. The department will do a lot of work, as the deputy minister pointed out before, and it's going to have to be. These are businesses. It has to be economically viable to them. I think they will make a determination whether it's economically viable or not. All the information would be processed and a recommendation given to the minister, and the minister will sign off on the recommendation. As the deputy said before, the one thing we don't want to do is set people up for failure. It's not our intention here, so we want to just ensure that all the boxes are checked and that they're, and as the vendors, they would want to make sure that it would be economically viable on their part as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister, for that clarification. Do we do this with other businesses that are not related to the liquor sales system? I guess my point is I completely understand and agree with the need for higher security clearances. That's commonplace with other jurisdictions that have allowed retail sales, notably Alberta. There are extensive security checks that need to be put in place. But before we license a business to operate, do we make sure that they can succeed as a business before allowing that to take place? Is that common practice for the GNWT or for municipalities that fall under the GNWT's authority? Thank you.
He's talking about businesses.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if we pick out a liquor vendor, I mean, we go through all the same checks and balances that we would with cannabis, so that they would know what they're getting into, and then they would make a determination if it's a business worth pursuing. As far as other businesses go in the Northwest Territory, different type of business, they all have to go through a application process. And again, these are businessmen and they business people, and they would know whether a business is economically viable, and they'll make a decision on their own whether they're going to pursue that opportunity or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And that's, with all due respect, that's not what these regulations say. I think if we allowed the business case to speak to its own strength, I mean, if an entrepreneur wants to open a store or get into this business, they'll do their own risk assessment before making that. Nobody would get into a business if they think they're going to fail at it. So I'm just wondering why these regulations say the minister needs to determine success or failure prior to approving an application. I still don't think we've gotten to the bottom of that. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you. My understanding of the regulations say the minister approves. Thank you. Them as a vendor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Minister. The regulations do say the minister approves, but they also say the person that submitted a business plan to the minister demonstrates to the minister's satisfaction that the operation of a cannabis store by the person would be economically viable.
Okay.
Does that help, Minister?
No.
Oh, Mr. Stewart.
So thanks, Mr. Chair. So consider a scenario where there's a request or an expression of interest to open an additional store in, let's say, the town of Hay River. And we put that out to RFP and we've got 5 applicants. Part of the assessment of trying to determine which one may be the most appropriate for that additional store, if the community only wants one additional store, is the business viability and the type of information they're providing. I think what this process is saying is that we want to work with those potential applicants to say, what do you think your market's going to look like? What is, based on the sales we've had to date, how do you think you're going to be able to do? What kind of expenditures do you see? To see that, in fact, when the minister is being provided a recommendation around that additional vendor, that it is somebody that's done all their homework and really understands the business that they're getting into. Because as the minister noted, we don't want to be in a situation of either having 5 different stores where the community may not want that, or additionally setting up people for failure. So it's really a check to make sure that they've done the kind of work they need to do to understand the business that they're getting into.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stewart. And I mean, I'm familiar with the Cannabis Act, and I know that communities are allowed to restrict or ban the sale of cannabis. So I don't know why the Liquor Commission is in a position to help limit the availability of cannabis by limiting stores, why the Liquor Commission is taking on that responsibility when the power to do that rests with the community and properly rests with the community through the governing act of this. So I appreciate where the department's coming from, that we don't want to set up people for fail, but there's a necessary amount of risk that comes from being an entrepreneur. When I look at these regulations, I see a very onerous process with a lot of ministerial discretion and not a lot of room for entrepreneurs to get out there and compete in a marketplace. I see a very a very powerful liquor commission that has already designated stores that we've been presented to that have a leg up on any other retailer that wants to operate in those stores or any other community that doesn't have a store. And there's construction ongoing, but that's my concern. We have 3 stores in operation now that have a 6-month lead on any other store, and they've already made it through this process. And we have a liquor commission that's going to determine whether or not other stores should be allowed based on the existence of those liquor stores, and that creates a problem of having entrepreneurs being able to compete fairly in a free marketplace. Those are more comments, but if you'd like to respond. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. The minister stated that on October 17th, cannabis will be available for sale in the 4 or 5 communities. And when I look through the framework here, I see there's some physical requirements that the store has to meet. The cannabis can't be, you can't be able to see it from outside of the store, so it has to be out of the line of view. There needs to be a special secure room that only cannabis can be kept in, no other products, no other equipment, just cannabis. And there needs to be special casing, only accessible by the employees behind the counter. And so when the minister says that cannabis will be for sale in these stores on October 17th, can he assure us that all of those renovations and all the required physical elements needed are complete? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick answer is yes, they're ready.
Mr. Simpson. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleague from the DHO who started to ask about monitoring and evaluation. Is there an overall monitoring evaluation framework? And why I ask this question is the next assembly, within 1 year of them coming into place, they're going to be required to carry out a public review of the implementation of this legislation and legalization and so on. So have we identified clear indicators other than sales that are going to help us understand what the outcomes of legalization and regulation have been? Things like, and I'm not an expert, are there going to be reductions in crime rates, police calls, greater absenteeism for workers? I have no idea, but do we have those logic models? Have we developed the monitoring and evaluation framework? And if not, when are we going to see it? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. At this point, we don't have one. We're working on putting one together. We could come back with committee as we proceed into this to put one, putting a framework together. And so I'll leave it at that. We don't have one at this point, but we are working on putting one together. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks.
Chair, yeah, I'm very interested in seeing that. What work are we doing to find a retailer for Inuvik? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is we're just starting today, and we will go out to for expressions of interest. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So can the minister tell us how many communities have decided to prohibit or restrict cannabis? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
We have none yet.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My last question on my list is the regulations and the information guide don't seem to provide for any kind of an appeal process if a vendor's application is turned down. Is that, so the minister has the final decision, there's no opportunity for judicial review if it got to that stage? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Short of an ombudsperson. Mr. Stewart?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there isn't an appeal mechanism, as the member notes in this. Issues around judicial reviews and those sorts of things, not a lawyer, so I'm not sure whether that's a possibility or not, or an ombudsman. But there isn't an appeal mechanism that's contemplated in this. The minister will have to make a decision.
Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, one of the issues that the committee's identified was an overall government-wide plan. I know we're here to talk about distribution and retail, but is there going to be a government-wide plan for implementation? And if so, when are we going to see it? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Can't allow that question, Mr. Riley. Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my understanding there was a commitment made to provide committee with an overall government plan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, given that, you know, we're 1 week away from legalization date, when are we going to see this plan? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll have to get back to committee. I can't remember the exact date.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister. Are these regulations finalized at this time, or will committee be allowed to provide input and make recommendations? Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They are finalized.
Is there any opportunity for this committee or for regular members to provide input into these regulations and make suggestions for improvement when they're next reviewed? Mr. Minister.
The committee is more than welcome to provide their comments on the regulations. Whether we implement them or not is another question.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee will be reviewing the regulations and provide correspondence as appropriate. Noting the time, we will conclude our public hearing at this point. Mr. Minister, would you like to provide any closing comments?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, thank committee again for their time. And as Member Thompson noted before, that I mean, this was something that was a law that was passed by the federal government, and I think our government has demonstrated that we're pretty well ready for this. There are going to be a couple of hiccups probably, but we'll work our way through those. And as I committed before, to working with committee on regular updates as it starts to be implemented. So I will stand by that commitment. And again, I appreciate committee time. I know this has been of significant interest to folks across the Northwest Territories, and as we go forward, we'll see how this all plays out. But we will keep committee up to date.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Thank you to your witnesses and to members of the public and other GNWT staff who've joined us today. This portion of the meeting is concluded. Minister, you and your witnesses are excused. Committee, noting the time, again, we will defer wrap-up until the next business meeting. All right? Yeah, adjourned. We are adjourned.